Who knows you the absolute best? You can talk with this person about any and everything, no matter how public or private the information is. Have you ever stopped to consider how you and this individual developed such a strong bond? Well, today I'm here to discuss with you a theory that examines just that. My name is Jade Johnson Grant, and today I'll be discussing the social penetration theory. I attend Liberty University Online, and I'm currently taking a course called Interpersonal Communication with Dr. Hark. In the duration of this presentation, I'll be explaining to you the social penetration theory and its various components. I'll be giving you a verbal literature review of what was covered in my research paper. And lastly, I'll discuss the strengths and limitations of the social penetration theory. The social penetration theory, or SPT, was developed by Erwin Altman and Dalmas Taylor in 1973. The basis of their theory states that relationships are formed and developed through self-disclosure. They use something called the onion model. What this means is, just as an onion has layers that can be peeled back, the same thing goes for human beings. We have a surface level that everyone can see, and then the more that is peeled back, the more intimate knowledge is revealed unto others, depending on how close we get. Now, self-penetration takes place through breadth and depth. Breadth of penetration refers to the amount of interaction or the various aspects of information that can be exchanged. Please excuse my facial expressions, my eyes acting up. Depth of penetration is the degree of intimacy of a typical interaction or exchange. So this has to do with breadth is the amount of topics that can be covered at a very surface level. And depth has to do with going deeper and sharing more intimate information when you talk about those topics. The way to achieving greater depth of penetration is assessed by a costs and rewards based system. In short, what this means is the rewards of self-disclosure must outweigh the cost in a relationship, much like the picture you see on the screen. The man is trying to reach money inside of a mousetrap. Now we have to assess, is it worth it to grab a couple of dollars out of a mousetrap and get your finger snapped? That's up to you to decide. When making cost and reward based assessments for relationships, people can go through 4 stages of relational development. The first stage is orientation. This is a very superficial stage where any information that you share is public information and it's not intimate. The next stage is the exploratory affective exchange. Now, Roloff says that this stage is an expansion of richness in communication in public areas. This more likely means that you're expanding in breadth, but not in depth of the topics. Aspects of personality that were guarded earlier are now revealed in more detail, but less emphasis is placed on caution. But this is a reminder that you're still in a public area, but because it's exploratory, you are exploring to figure out if you want to make your way into the next step, which is the affective exchange. In this phase or in this stage, trust forms and greater depth takes place. And this is generally the stage where romantic relationships begin to take place. Now, the social risk is high here because you're making a decision on whether or not you want to take the step to the next phase, which is the most intimate and the final stage of relational development, the stable exchange. In this exchange, the stage is highly intimate, and it allows the partners to predict each other's actions and responses very well. A great example of this is a married couple. Have you ever seen a couple and you look at them and they finish each other's sentences and always know what each other's going to say? They know how to work things out very well. They're just very well established because a great level of intimacy has taken place over time and over using cost and rewards based systems, breadth of penetration, and depth of penetration. Dallas Taylor, who was one of the developers of SPT, submitted a journal article as a dissertation in 1968, and it was about the social penetration processes. This begins the literature review section. His hypothesis of this study was that breadth changes over time dependent upon the stages or levels of intimacy. And in this study, he used roommates, but they were only males and they were individuals who did not have any prior relationship. In order to test them, he used 2 different 30-item questionnaires and he gave them to the roommates over a period of 13 weeks. In this, his purpose was to measure the social penetration by means of the information that they exchanged over the 13 weeks and the mutual activities that they began to do with one another as roommates. Now, in order to properly assess the study, Dallas Taylor used independent variables such as the experiment duration, the levels of intimacy, and the predisposition to self-disclose with other people. This was measured before the actual study began, so this was like a pre-study, and this was to determine whether or not the males were high revealing individuals or if they were more prone to be low revealing individuals. And the dependent variables of this study were the mutual activities that they shared and did together, and the amount of self-disclosure that took place. And from this study, Taylor found that the mutual activities and the self-disclosure between the roommates increased significantly over time, and a greater number of the exchanges were classified as non-intimate as opposed to intimate. But the high revealing dyads had more frequent exchanges and they expressed more intimate details than the ones who were low revealers in the first place. The social penetration theory was not only used to look at roommates and how they interact and grow, but it was also used in 2011 to look at computer-mediated communication versus face-to-face interactions. This was a study conducted by Zhang, Bazarova, and Hancock. They believed that CMC would be greater than face-to-face interactions as it related to high self-disclosure and intimacy. For the study that they conducted, they had dyads engage in communication in order to come up with 10 tips for incoming freshmen. Along with these 10 tips that they had to suggest, they also had to give their reasonings why they gave these 10 tips. In doing so, the goal was to discover how much information would be disclosed when they gave their reasonings. These researchers were not surprised at all to find out that their hypotheses were correct, that intimate disclosure through computer-mediated communication did yield greater intimacy than the face-to-face interactions. There was no positive relation shown between the different demographics they use as dependent variables to self-disclosure. Now, disclosure was constant across observed conditions to find that equivalently intimate disclosures produce greater intimacy in CMC than face-to-face interactions. And this was the first study conducted that had to do with the social penetration theory that looked for the similarities or differences between self-disclosure and computer-mediated communication or face-to-face interactions. The results of the last study and the implications of it are a great segue into the strengths and limitations of the theory. Now, quite frankly, SPT has extended academia and added to it by producing a theory that can be further researched to find greater information, as was shown with the CMC versus face-to-face interaction, as it was the first to do something new in that aspect to the social penetration theory. Now, a limitation of this theory is the main focus, which is self-disclosure. Self-disclosure by itself is not an independent variable that can be studied. Self-disclosure will always depend on something else about an individual, and people are always changing. So it's hard to believe for some theorists and researchers that there's any real concrete evidence to self-disclosure being the key to intimacy and relational development. SPT is not without its limitations, but it has been instrumental in discovering relational development across many different types of relationships. As we've seen in the presentation, there are 2 different types of relationships that were discussed, not including romantic involvement at all. And an important note to know at the end about SPT is that the stages of relational development are cyclic and not linear in progression or development. This was brought up at the end because, as you see on the slide, the next point says that the theory has been extended and has more room for growth to discover more about shaping and maintaining intimacy. The theory was once in belief, or not the theory, but the theorists were once in belief that there was a linear progression in their relational development, only to revise it and go back and extend the theory to show that the stages are actually cyclic. So there's plenty more that can be done in research of SPT, or the social penetration theory, and learning about how to grow in relational development and increase your intimacy in your relationships. Thank you for your time. Once again, my name is Jade Johnson Grant, and I discussed with you my findings on the social penetration theory.